Net zero. Now, we hear that phrase from political and business leaders every day. It means reducing carbon emissions by as much as possible and then offsetting the rest. And while a growing number of companies have set targets to reach net zero by 2050, fewer of them have released detailed plans. So, Emily, to you first of all, the government's asked companies to voluntarily release their net zero plans. I think particularly they want to do it ahead of COP. But do you think it should be mandatory?
Well, I certainly think it's incredibly important. I mean, first of all, let's say it's fantastic that increasing number of businesses are starting to recognise the importance of putting in place net zero targets, but then also about trying to work out how they're going to actually achieve those with actual detailed plans from today, because we need action today and we need to understand what can be done today rather than off in the distant future. So I do think it's really important that businesses, do recognise the challenge and then respond to it.
Well, yes, and it's interesting you say an increasing number because the WWF released some details that said that only 19% of major UK companies, they say, there we go, have published a detailed action plan for reaching net zero. So, Dan, if you do say, force all companies to release a plan, do you also need that audited in some way? Do you need the plans to be seen to be credible and also for any progress to be monitored?
Well, there are exceptions to every rule, of course, but at the moment companies aren't doing enough. And I agree with Emily, it's great to see that so many companies are taking it seriously, but a lot of companies are still indulging in greenwash, frankly. So you really can't rely on an industry to police itself or investors to police that industry either. And that's why what government says at COP26 is going to be so important, because they need to level the playing field. They need to be clear on what we need to do next. And it is time for action and not words.
So sorry, Dan, you want the government to sort of lay out parameters for businesses, do you? Is that what you're calling on from them?
I think governments in general, I wouldn't even just say it's just a UK government thing. This is a global challenge, but I think UK government has a strong role to play as we're hosting COP26, and I would like to see them go much, much further than they have done before in terms of being clear on net zero and what businesses, particularly energy-intensive industries, need to do next.
Well, yes, and there's a point there, isn't there, Emily, that different businesses have very different needs in terms of reaching net zero. I think Cambridge University set out plans to reach net zero by 2038 last year, but that's a very different prospect to a steel company or an airline trying to get to net zero.
Oh, absolutely. So each different sector is going to have its own challenges. I think one of the really critical things, though, and you mentioned it a moment ago, is that the need within that net zero to do everything that you can as a business to reduce your emissions and leave offsetting really to those aspects that absolutely cannot be reduced. So one example would be, for example, in terms of business travel, if everyone was just saying, oh, we're going to offset all our business travel, continue as normal, then we simply wouldn't have enough offsets to go around. Businesses need to be looking at how they can reduce their emissions, travel less. We're all doing it, in many business interactions virtually instead at the moment because of the pandemic. That needs to be ingrained in terms of normal business action. That's just one of a myriad of examples where the first thing ought to be cutting our emissions and then reserving offsetting only for those things that really cannot be cut.
So that's what business can do. And going back down to what you think governments should do, you talked about them setting out frameworks. What about also making clear what their priorities are in the future, whether it's investing in green hydrogen or green steel or carbon capture? Does that make a difference to businesses in knowing how to go about making their own plans?
It does, and frankly, there are a huge amount of technologies on the table, and that's useful, but it actually has become less productive, I would say. There's more options now than are needed, and some work better than others. So I think a more focused approach. I think if you're a fan of renewables like I am, you would actually say that maybe things like carbon capture and storage and green hydrogen are a little way off, and we should be focusing on the now technologies like batteries, wind and solar. And in terms of the energy intensive stuff, maybe we need to have a really hard discussion as consumers, as people who consume, about do we need to consume as much steel, glass, paper, etc. And I think that's the big question that we should all be asking ourselves.